Well, I'm going to go ahead and start so that I don't let you out late. And I want to start with, No, I don't know if it's just a youth thing and I just never grew up, or if it's a generational thing, but I like very sarcastic and satirical things. And there's a website called Babylon Bee. If you've ever seen it, I don't know, but it takes some of the parts of our Christian culture, our church culture, and sort of pokes fun at them sometimes just in a lighthearted way, and sometimes in an actually profound way. Sometimes. Anyways, along the lines of our class, I ran into this one. Atheist driver spots Jesus fish eating Darwin fish, repents. Harrisonburg, Virginia. Local atheist Nick Boyette was converted to Christianity Wednesday while sitting at a stoplight, sources confirmed. The miracle occurred when Boyette, 38, noticed a startling bumper sticker on the car in front of him. Ever since freshman philosophy class, I've believed God is a fiction and humans are the product of natural selection. An accidental collocation of atoms, Boyette recounted to reporters. Then I spotted that car decal and heard the sound of crumbling. It was my worldview. I saw that Jesus Christ could eat Charles Darwin for lunch, just as the Jesus fish bearing the word truth was swallowing up the smaller, weaker Darwin fish. The evangelistic driver, Steve Imadi, has sported the decal for 10 years. I've always hoped some heathen would see the quality of my driving and then learn the reason for the hope within me. I never expected to snag a real live atheist. Boyette's newfound joy can scarcely be contained. Before coming face to face with the defeat of that Darwin fish, I thought Christianity was a joke. Not anymore. If Jesus can gobble up Darwinism, then he definitely can rise from the grave. The new believer is excited to become a fisher of men himself. God doesn't call us to check our witness at the car door, he explained. I've narrowed my bumper sticker choice to either the Big Bang Theory, God spoke and bang, it happened, or do you follow Jesus this closely? Whichever I go with, I trust God will use it to save others who are driving toward destruction like I was. Pretty funny stuff. So, to be clear, I'm not anti-bumper stickers or anything like that. I don't have a problem with them. But I think it's a good, comical, satirical reminder that we're not intended to depend on some sort of impersonal means to win people over. We're supposed to be making disciples, right? And that's a life-on-life kind of thing, a personal encounter. So I don't want to forget that personally, and I hope we don't. Yes?
Quick question.
Go right ahead.
Why did Jesus say, go, make a commission, go and make disciples of all nations, instead of saying, go and get the word out for everyone to believe in me? Now, disciple, I've looked at this, okay? Disciple, yeah. I'm looking at it from someone's point of view that might, it means that disciple means truly, comes from, I think it's Greek discipline, or the root of discipline, master of self. And Jesus was an overcomer. He overcame what no human being could ever do. Being out in the desert, what he did. The human part of him, even though he was God, he overcame. Why did he say go and make disciples? I'm confused about what exactly we're supposed to do and how, because it's never been clear to me. Okay.
Well, let me offer one. This may not be a conclusive or exhaustive answer to that, but something I ran into recently that was helpful to me. That's in regards to that. It's a Christianity Today article that I read, and it's talking about sort of a movement in our understanding of what conversion is, from revivalism to something that's more of a process. Now, I'm not going to try and make a definitive theological statement right now about that, but I think there's something poignant to well, first of all, there's a cultural reality of how we're engaging culture and who we are as a church and how we're understanding the process of somebody coming to Christ. That's one of the reasons I had those scales and I talk about moving somebody along towards Christ. Because I think there's a movement away from this idea of kind of, there's this big movement happening and you bring somebody to a meeting and they make a decision at a moment. I'm not necessarily saying people don't still at a moment sort of have this before and after, but it seems that there's a lot more understanding of people having the sort of process that they're going through to come to Christ in a lot of ways. Now, there'll always be people that, I'm sure we could come up with stories from experience that will go one way or the other. Doesn't have to, I don't think it has to be one or the other. But I think there's definitely more of an openness to that you may harvest this person here that's ready versus this person's in a long-term process. And you can listen to a lot of Christian speakers that have different backgrounds about how they came to Christ. Like J. Warner Wallace, for instance. He's very evidential. He's coming from a detective background. So he took all the data and sifted through it and ran it through his gamut and slowly came around. Versus somebody else, maybe even now or from a former era, who had somebody shared the gospel with them within a culture that was amenable to the gospel in a lot easier fashion. And that person in that venue or in that milieu could just make that choice, right? So making disciples, it's taking somebody, as far as God will use you, from being completely in rebellion to God and His Son, Jesus Christ, and bringing them along to a spot to where they are looking to Him to understand how to live, right? A disciple is somebody that follows somebody else who knows the way. So I see a lot of room for moving somebody to that spot. I don't know if that answers your question, but those are my thoughts. Does anybody else want to comment on that? Sure.
You're in that, the Lord meant you to be part of that particular thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes, especially with Jewish people, it's very hard to get them to come because they want to keep it to themselves. They're afraid.
Yeah. And yeah, I think the beauty of some of these elements we're talking about is it gives you the freedom to just live alongside of somebody else over a long period of time. Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's not, this is the only way. This is just one tool in our tool belt.
I think it's wonderful when people that you do have time to live one lady 20 years who is as kind as Russia is. And she is dying a week before her death. She was due Yeshua into the life.
Wow. Yeah. Right. Yeah, ultimately the theological reality is the Holy Spirit has to change somebody's heart. So we're just looking for any way that He wants to use us, whether it's rational or emotional or service or love or well, let's dive in. And what I want to do is go over some new territory, and then if there's time, I have a couple of things to revisit. What's that? Well, it looks similar, but are you saying, do you have it now?
Yeah, do we have this so we can follow along?
Was it on the...
Second page of tonight's handouts.
Yes, it's in the second. That's why I'm saying I might come back to that other sheet. Sorry about that. Should be the second. Did you find it? So we've been looking at different shortcomings of views or statements people might make as we converse with them. And that's all part of the task of what I'm saying, influencing them in the right direction. So we hope that with careful and caring conversation, we can leave them, these interactions, leave people with something to think about. And it's what Greg Koukl calls leave a rock in their shoe, right? Something that they can't stop thinking about until they figure it out. So last week we discussed the suicide tactic. And that tactic is basically involving, basically bringing awareness to a person that has a view that they have a self-refuting view, right? The view itself commits suicide in some way. So this is basically that the view tries to both affirm and deny something at the same time. So remember the image of the page that says this page left intentionally blank, which it actually isn't anymore because somebody took the time to print it on the page. So that message is conveyed and it's no longer blank. So it's both affirming that it's blank and it's existing as not blank at the same time. And all this, again, is done primarily through, especially initially, through asking questions. And we're trying to help them question their own view and question things in their own mind. And we looked at a list of examples. Let me see if I can find that. Here are some that we looked at. I think there were some others too. We looked at a list of these and these suicidal or self-refuting statements. And they all share some sort of general problem where they're self-refuting. And some, or I guess most of them, or a lot of them, it's a logical issue. So there's an internal logic to the statement that's self-refuting. We talked about them breaking the rule of the law of non-contradiction, right? So you can't have, Aristotle basically said, something can't be and not be at the same time and in the same way, right? So that gets around trying to say. We were talking a little bit about if you say my brother or my brother is an only child. Well, if you explain it with enough nuance, you could get around it, but not at the same time in the same way. You know, all things being equal. So, in some of these, the logic just fails, but some of these, and this is where we get to practical suicide. Some of these statements are self-refuting in practice rather than in principle, right? So it's something about them in the real world versus just the internal logic of them. For example, this sign is another funny one. Now, there's no inherent contradiction logically, right, of there being a sign not being in use. That idea is not logically problematic, is it? A sign that's not being used, a not in use sign, right? That's not a incoherent. Okay, but in this case, we move from the idea to a sign sitting there telling us that it's not in use. Suddenly, in the real world, we have a played out self-refutation. So even though it wasn't logically incoherent in the real world, once it exists, then it is a problem. So I wrote here unlivable views because many times people will have an element of their worldview that when you press it into the real world situation, it's not really a livable view. And actually what I believe is a good rule of philosophy is as you entertain different options in philosophy, if the philosophy isn't livable, then it's not really worth much. If you can't figure out what the world's like in a way that it's going to be livable, then you haven't really gained anything. Sorry. Okay, so let me give you a classic, you call it a paradigmatic example of this. Can you picture in your head what I mean when I say a morally indignant moral relativist? You know what that is? This would be somebody that holds to moral relativism. It's basically the idea that morality is relative to the individual, right? Rather than there being some objective, overarching morality. It's up to you, and that's okay. Okay, so that's not inherently self-refuting, right? That isn't logically impossible. But if you take the motto of this relativist, something like this: don't push your morality on me or anybody else. So what happens when you try to take the idea and put it into reality? You move from this private belief or idea to a public statement. The person stating it is incriminating themselves, right? Because they are trying to put a morality on somebody else, which is exactly in contradiction to their statement. So any promotion of the relativist view, any attempt to make it the rule for everybody, instantly breaks the rule, right? So that's practical suicide, and I think that's a very real kind of conversation you could run into any day, anywhere, any city in SoCal. So here's a couple more unique ways in which a statement or a view can be self-refuting. Another version is called sibling rivalry. Now, my middle daughter just turned 5 today, so we celebrated that. And for these posed pictures, they were laughing because they weren't actually being rivals at the time, but trust me, they have their moments where we have plenty of sibling rivalry in our house. So those are my cute older daughters pretending. But there's a couple other phrases you could use to describe this idea. One would be, if you've heard the phrase, mutually exclusive. Okay, if you have two things that don't work together, like if one's true, the other's not, and vice versa. Or another way of saying it. And by the way, I love this little symbol there. I want to put that on a T-shirt. I don't know why. I just really like the way it looks. I think it's funny. But another way of saying it is, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you can have a beautiful cake that you want to just look at and enjoy it, but you also want to enjoy it by having it in your stomach. You can't have both at the same time. So it's one or the other kind of thing. So again, this is a book I draw a lot out of, Tactics by Greg Koukl. If you don't have it, you should get it. Anyways, I'll borrow some of his stories. So he offers an example of what sibling rivalry would look like. The story begins with him interacting with a waitress, right? I mentioned that before as an easy opportunity to have a conversation. And this waitress believes that morality is relative, okay? So we have another moral relativist, which it's up to each person kind of morality. So they're talking about that, but further, so he's sort of pressing for what her issues are with God or Christianity. Further on in the conversation, she mentions all the evil in the world and the suffering and the impasse that she has with how could you have God being all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, and allowing so much evil. So what's the impasse between those two? What's the impasse between being a moral relativist and saying it's up to each person, and then at the same time, in the same breath or conversation, saying there's so much evil that God can't exist? Do you see any interplay here? Anybody want to take a stab at why those are at odds with each other? Why are these two things at odds with each other? to have a problem against God or Christianity because, one, I'm a moral relativist and I believe that morality is up to the individual. And two, there's too much evil, so God probably doesn't exist because he wouldn't be around. If he was around, he would get rid of the evil. Do you see any potential impasse there?
You didn't mention it, but for me, he gave us free will. So he could think that he doesn't, because that's not what he's after.
That's absolutely true, right? That's a valid response to at least part of the problem of evil, is free will. But what I'm after is seeing an impasse between the two objections that the person is making. So, well, think of this. Sorry, it's not on there. It's on here. Okay, what are these? These are essentially two objections to the Christian worldview. On the one hand, Christianity is rejected because of its exclusivist morality or its objective morality, right? It's a morality that's transcendent and true for all people at all times, right? Rather than just up to the individual. On the other hand, they're calling God on the carpet for allowing so much objective evil. So we have to ask, which is it? Because the two don't go together. At a minimum, this person should see that they couldn't maintain both objections. Okay, so sorry, I'm thinking ahead to this other one, and I think it's a similar example, but I'm going to use it here. So Ravi Zacharias describes this response to the problem of evil. When you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. But that's who you're trying to disprove, not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. And if there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? Okay, so if you have the problem of evil, you have objective morality. By citing that problem, you're citing objective morality. But at the other side of your mouth, if you're a moral relativist, you're saying it's up to the individual. So this is where sibling rivalry comes in, because there's opposing ideas in the two objections. So that's what I'm saying. At a minimum, they've got to give up one. Once they see the logic there, they have to give up one. And they could still press the other if they want. No, if we're optimistic, maybe they'll say, hey, maybe I'm a little reckless in my thinking. Maybe I need to go back to the drawing board and sort of reconsider the whole issue as a whole. That would be even better. Yes?
Do you know, this is interesting. If you look at just creation and look at the way God, darkness is absence of light, everything's full of paradox. Even in God's thinking, in God's creation. So it's almost like we're almost prone to look at things from these wide, varying angles because creation is such that darkness before the dawn, light, do you know all these things? I can't think of all these examples, but God fashioned it that way, and it is paradoxical. And God wants us to think, it seems to me, He wants us to think.
Mm-hmm.
But why did God create such contrast and leave us scratching our heads? Oh.
Sure. Yeah, and in the instance of good and evil, those concepts, a big part of that is, if you look at the coherency of the Christian worldview as a whole, you in order for God to have a creature that can love Him in a way that glorifies Him, it's got to be a free kind of love, and then you have free will enter, and then that muddies the equation. So if you consider evil a privation of good, like an absence of good, then it's sort of a necessary component of having a God-glorifying creation, because free will leads to falling short of the good. And then once you have evil, then you have other things that go along with that. Anyways, let's not, I don't want to get too far into the problem of evil, but... and here, let me give a couple more. Again, these are all basically variations on self-refutation or suicide. And here's one more view. This one's called infanticide. I know, these names are maybe a little grisly sounding, but they're purposeful because they get the point across, the logical point. So this is when a concept, and we'll call the concept the child concept, depends on another more foundational concept that we'll call the parent. Okay? So the parent, and when this happens, the parent concept devours the child concept. That's why we call it infanticide. Now, you can have, characteristically, we'll try to give some examples, but characteristically what you'll have is somebody has a view, and some of these overlap, so this is almost similar to the last one, but somebody has a view, and that view is at odds with another view, but that other view that it's at odds with is actually foundational to the view itself. So it's sort of like biting the hand that feeds it. So here's a little metaphorical version in this comic. So you have the lady who isn't, I don't know that she's the parent, but at least she's an authority figure. So she's sort of like the parent concept and the kids are the child concept. And I'm assuming that's Jack and Jill. And the boy says, "Don't try to stop us, lady. We don't care about the dangers. We're going up that hill to fetch a pail of water." So this is the unwritten part that you don't see before you read the Jack and Jill rhyme. But okay, so what's going on here by analogy? There's already a consequence in place logically for what's going to happen when they go up there, and even though that's set in place ahead of time, they're still standing in rebellion to her. And what's going to happen is they're going to fail because what she said is true. So, no matter how much they try to avoid what's going to happen, we already know the story, right? That they're going to fall, despite their desire to just do their own thing. So let me hash it out in the problem of evil one more time. So people observe evil in the form of, it could be human action, it could be disasters, disease, whatever else. And it falls dramatically short of how things ought to be, right? And then the second step is, how could I believe in a God that would allow that? That wouldn't really be God, right? Because he's supposed to be able to deal with that sort of stuff. So here's the key. They are depending on some moral law to show that this evil exists. And again, we could look at that Ravi Zacharias quote again, and it would display this. So there's a dependency, right? You can't have... Before we had a sibling rivalry between moral relativism and then an objective code in order to make the problem of evil go through. In this case, we're just over here on the problem of evil side. We're basically saying, you have a problem with God because he's not, if he were to exist, he's not making things how they ought to be, objectively, morally speaking. But if you try to survey the moral theories, There's no moral theory that will give you that foundation but God. This is sort of the moral argument, actually. But so in order to, do you see what I'm saying? In order to rail against God in the problem of evil, you have to have God to have the moral code by which you're scrutinizing him. Does that make sense? So there's that dependency relationship, the child on the foundational parent concept, and so they're sort of pulling the rug out from under themselves either direction. Kind of like Jack and Jill here. Or as I call it, biting the hand that feeds you. So you see those are all similar. They're all self-refuting varieties. And really what they are is just little observations we can have as we're listening to what people have to say. There's already enough to argue and debate and discuss without being stuck in fallacies. So what we want to do is dispense with the poor thinking and then get down to the real business, hopefully. And a lot of the process with people that haven't thought that deeply or just borrowing slogans is just sort of gently debunking that logic. Yes?
I think two kind of minds. One does well in logic and philosophy, and that's not me. I'm great in math and facts. But this kind of heart is really hard for me to remember and to use.
Sure. Well, let's take the moral relativism, for instance, right? I mean, you're aware of this kind of person and it's almost more of a mood in culture than it is a definitive philosophical statement by people. It's more like this feeling that things should be fair and we shouldn't judge. And what happens in this postmodern culture is that people move from that sort of feeling or gut reaction into making definitive statements.
I saw a great example of this last night in Congress.
In what?
In Congress.
Oh, okay. I didn't see.
Well,
Somebody.
both sides just stood up and said what they believed, and they wouldn't vote and they wouldn't do anything. They just wanted to call names to each other.
Sure.
You know, that's what I see.
But in just, I mean, trying to make it simple here. Next time if that conversation comes up for you and somebody promotes moral relativism, by simply asking them how that works, because they're making a statement about how people ought to live. They're basically saying everybody ought to be a moral relativist when they make their statement. So you can graciously call them on the carpet so that they understand in their own mind, oh, wait a second, that doesn't work. Because I'm doing the very thing I'm telling you not to do. So,
I never get that answer, though.
you never what?
I never get that answer.
Hmm.
You know, I have an older brother who's a philosopher and a younger one who isn't all interested in anything but making money. And either one of them can have a discussion, but they're on a different line.
Yeah.
And they know what I think and they don't want to hear it. And that's just my example. Just as you're
No, I understand.
I can see my older brother and see the younger one.
Well, it's definitely contextual. I mean, everybody in here has a different set of people in their sphere of influence. So out of everything we'll cover, there'll be certain things that will fit right in. And hey, if you run into somebody with a philosophy degree, then you might as well just go to sleep, because they're gonna be like me, and they're gonna use what we call 25-cent words that we learned in school. But no, even here, let me back up for a second. That's not a bad. What I'll do is I'll back up to this, and then. Sorry, let me get my. Time is at 7:41.
Like posing for you as examples?
Yeah. Well, they like taking pictures all the time. I'm going to go back to this it's a good moment for a good moment to hit this other slide, since we were just talking about it, and then we'll take a little break and then come back and do some practice. Yes, I can get those to you at the break. Okay, so this is back on that first page that we skipped. Now this is Bertrand Russell, sort of the well-known marquee atheists today are people like Christopher Hitchens, who just passed away, or Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, guys like that. Now Bertrand Russell is from the era before them, but he had that same stature as being sort of the atheist, or one of the atheists. So this is a statement from him. So I want to bring this up because a lot of what we're talking about is, common conversations, regular old Joes. But this guy, was like the philosopher, the atheist philosopher. So let's look at his statement. I conclude that while it is true that science cannot decide questions of value, that would be like good and bad, that is because they cannot be intellectually decided at all and lie outside the realm of truth and falsehood. Whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific methods, and what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. So this is sort of he's basically stating a view that we would call scientism, which is basically that the only way we get knowledge is through science, and everything else not only doesn't get us truth, it's just doesn't mean anything. The only meaningful statements are scientific ones.
Oh, but this is self-refuting what he's saying. This is
Yes, why is it self-refuting? Go ahead.
Science, because he's saying that questions of value cannot be intellectually decided, and science can't play a role in that, because these kinds of things lie outside the realm of the truth and falsehood. But then again, he's saying that, but then again he's saying, well, whatever knowledge is there must be attained by science, and that mankind cannot know what science cannot discover. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. That makes no sense, because the thing that he said, that these questions of value cannot be intellectually decided, and he's saying that that's the only way they can be decided. I see that. And there's things like God gave us this conscience, which is like a separate entity that I think that people kind of have a sense of right from wrong, even though they may not be able to explain it.
Right. And we would call that person a person who identifies that innate perception of morality as a moral realist. Now, you could say that there's a practical suicide element to this, because if in his real life, or any philosopher in their real life that goes out and lives and is offended when somebody does something that they feel is wrong to them, then they're identifying. Now they could say, well, that's just part of our biological and evolutionary makeup, so it's not an absolute transcendent sort of thing. So then we would come up with an example, like we would say, well, that's fine, that's a possibility, but are you saying that it's ever okay for people to torture babies for fun? Or is it ever okay, if you want to pick something more apropos that it's even harder to get around, say, is it okay to beat homosexuals to death based on their sexual identity? Well, however you feel about that issue, that is not okay. And it will always be the case that that's not okay for all people all the time.
Except for those who affirm that homosexuals all the time.
Well, yeah, and I would say that they are wrong.
Well,
But that's the
but
whole
you're not
puzzle.
using science to come to that conclusion. You're coming to alternative epistemology. You know that for some
Mm-hmm.
Some people would struggle a bit with how anthropology enlightens us with regard to cultural relativity. And we've been approaching the notion of relativity always at the individual level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't brought up cultural.
Relativity at a cultural,
Mm-hmm.
there's relativity at a cultural level,
Right.
or within a group kind of thing.
This is going to be vague. I'd have to look up the exact quote, but William Lane Craig, in a debate with a lady who was an atheist, and I'm sorry for the vagueness of this, but essentially he uses her quote, which is something like this: any argument that will prove that something that we would collectively identify as immoral, anything that will explain that away will be less apparent than our moral intuition on the matter. In other words, I guess what I'm promoting is at rock bottom, as a moral realist, I'm going to always have something that I can point to that it's going to be.
So you fall back to intuition rather than to science.
Well, I would call it moral perception. Yeah.
Outside or
Yeah. Well, that's fine because that helps me. Yes.
parameters of
Yeah.
Richard Russell.
Sure.
But one of my favorite things about some of this is really the overview.
Mm-hmm.
Back when Webster's New International Dictionary 3 came out.
By the way, Rod is a former librarian of a university library, so if you're wondering if he just sits around and reads dictionaries.
And I taught philosophy for 50 years.
Yes.
But as an English teacher and a grammarian,
Uh-huh.
there was a huge shift in point of view from Webster's second to Webster's third dictionaries. It was a move from the prescriptive quality of WNID 2. That
Uh-huh.
is, it is a dictionary that told us how a word ought to be used. And NID 3 became descriptive.
Oh, I see.
It stopped prescribing how people ought to use words and simply made an effort to capture how people in fact use words.
So they sort of recognized and submitted to the changing languages. Yeah.
Joining of linguistic intuitions
Mm-hmm.
and science would create a very interesting kind of value problem in terms, for example, of how one ought to do something. And yeah, the ought is a huge problem for people who do not have some basis on which to base
Sure.
some standard. And I think it's probably generally true that everybody, Bertrand Russell included, would have some kind of standard for things that they would call right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But what he is saying is that that's not science's business. He's not denying that people have values and make value judgments. What he's denying is that those value judgments are founded on something called science. And I think by and large, there's a high level of concurrence with that idea. That is, by and large, yeah, that kind of rings true.
Yeah.
Because we can look at it, for example, and say, well, the Bible tells me something. The Bible tells me so.
Mm-hmm.
And because I accept it as God's word, then I believe there's a God who has spoken and there's a record of what God has said. And therefore, there is some obligation incurred upon us to do what God has said.
Mm-hmm.
But that's because I have accepted the prior notion that God is. The Hebrew writer, for example, 11:6 just says something like, "For we must believe that he is, and that he is the rewarder of those who diligently seek him." The Hebrew writer is not trying to prove the existence of God. The Hebrew writer is simply affirming the necessity of accepting the notion of God. And I think it would be reasonably correct to say essentially the Hebrew notion of God.
Sure.
And but that includes affirming the existence of someone or something called God, and that person or thing is of a particular nature. That is, it's a God who rewards those who diligently seek Him.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I think, pretty much the full statement made in the 6th verse of chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. So we must believe that God is, and that essentially, from some points of view, moves the whole question out of the matter of science, although we may argue from science that we can't explain things other than adding a hypothesis that God exists. But that does not necessarily prove that hypothesis that God
Yeah.
exists.
Well, I understand the alternative there, and I would almost, to just throw out some quick words and then move into this, but that sounds similar to what a scientist would call non-overlapping magisteria, where there are issues of separate regards. But I am sticking to my guns, as it were, that he is going beyond and saying it's because they cannot be intellectually decided at all, which is a further claim. But we don't have to get into that. We
You
can.
and I use a different definition of intellectually decided.
Sure. Well, let's bracket we can easily talk more about that, but let's bracket that one, and let me list a few other things. Basically to show some things. Let's say you run into this type of claim. Here's a list of things that science cannot prove or establish as true, but are rationally acceptable nonetheless. And I won't mention ethical beliefs because we already talked about that, but now consider for a moment logic and math, right? That seems like something very integral to science, doesn't it? Now, what science can you do to establish the truth of logic and math? You can't. They're presupposed by science, okay? So that's one, logic and math. I'd put those in the same category. What about metaphysical truths? So these are a little bit different. These would be statements like, it would be rationally acceptable for me to say the earth wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. The earth wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. Right?
The world hasn't been created. It's all an idea in the mind of God, and we haven't had it.
Okay. Well, I won't go there, but here's another metaphysical truth that I think is rationally acceptable without using science to get there. There are other minds other than my own. There are other minds existent in this room. There's no way I can corroborate that scientifically, or that the external world is real. Okay, so those are simple ideas that are not scientifically founded. And the best one, I think, is that science itself cannot be proven by science. If you want a nice, deep-sounding one, there are certain assumptions in the special theory of relativity. One of them being that the speed of light moves in one direction at a constant rate between 2 points. Now, there are competing interpretations of Einstein's field equations that are empirically equivalent. And there's no test in principle that we could do to decide between the two. We have to just assume or presume that light travels in the special theory of relativity, that it is a one-way constant speed. But there's a question, I don't want to, we'll get lost in the trees here and lose the forest, but basically it boils down to what is being affected? Time and the speed of light, or the devices themselves that are the testing apparatus? Anyways, you can read about, read about that later. But there are a number of unprovable presumptions in science that science itself cannot prove. They're preliminary before science. So point being is, when you run into this, it's actually self-refuting, because the best way to describe how it's self-refuting is that you cannot establish this view scientifically. This is a non-scientific statement. So if he's true, he's false. If he's right, then his statement is also wrong. That's why I call it self-refuting. Okay, let's stretch our legs, grab some water or coffee, and we'll come back and... Yes?
How would you, in 10 words or less, so I don't pick up...
Yes?
How would you define metaphysical from a philosophical...
Yes. Metaphysics is the study of... It's like the science of existence. It's the study of what exists and what's the nature of what exists.
Or the nature of what exists.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what the word meta means?
It means above.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So rather than physics, like, what's this made of, this table made of? It's the underlying deeper reality, as it were. It does share that sort of in common when you go to the bookstore and you see metaphysics and it's not philosophy. Because they're also trying to get at a sort of a deeper reality, but it's more on a spiritual type of thing.
Yeah.
But in philosophy, it's also that same thing. What's the deeper reality, but more in a rational sense. Like, how do we?
Meaning.
Not necessarily the meaning, but the nature of it. You're sort of tinkering with what are the building blocks of existence. Things like, what properties does a thing have? Well, you can't go in the lab and take the concept property and put it on a petri dish, but you can talk about it intellectually. So there's a discovery of those things in it. Okay, let's take a break. I'm going to get a drink. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Well, I want to read one more little tidbit here just for fun, and then we'll actually try out some of our some of these interactions. It's a little section called "You Are What You Eat." Again, this is in the Tactics book. You are what you eat.
What you eat, okay.
And this is one last example of the suicide view, or self-refuting view. I once saw a sign in a restaurant that read, "You are what you eat." I pointed out to the waitress that if we are what we eat, then we couldn't be something until we have eaten something. But we can't eat something unless we are something. Therefore, it's not true that we are what we eat. The waitress, unschooled in the finer points of self-refuting arguments, looked at me and said, "You'll have to talk to the manager." It's pretty funny.
It's also interesting when one looks at how embryos and fetuses eat, what they eat. There's tons of medical
Oh, yeah,
evidence.
yeah.
Health and well-being of the baby depends on food that it gets through the mother.
That's right. And there's actually cells that go back and forth.
And I've heard too, if a baby in his womb feels a deprivation of what it needs for its substance, that will carry out into after birth and a person's tendency toward obesity. And that its origin is in the womb, not outside the womb.
Okay, so for practice,
You are your gene. I'm working on a little piece. I'm diabetic, and I'm working on a piece. I'm calling it suicide by fork.
yeah. Okay, so for practice, I've assembled a collage here of bumper stickers and slogans. And just by the way, this T-shirt design here is an interesting play on words. Well, it's sort of getting at, I just threw it on there so you could see it. It doesn't necessarily have to be used for this practice, although it could. But the front says, intolerance is a beautiful idea, which of course, at first glance is like, well, why would you have a shirt that says that? Nobody wants to be intolerant. Then on the back it has examples. Mother Teresa was intolerant of poverty. Bono was intolerant of AIDS. Nelson Mandela was intolerant of apartheid. MLK was intolerant of racism, and Jesus was intolerant of bigotry. So it's sort of this, I would call it a little bit of reclaiming the term, where tolerance has become, there's sort of two senses of tolerance. Tolerance, respect, and tolerance, accept. So it used to be that tolerance means you respect somebody's view, and that means you tolerate it. You're entitled to your view, I'm entitled to mine, and we have a mutual respect about it. But the sort of the modern spin on it is to tolerate somebody means to accept their view. So, or act in a way that enables them to pursue their view, or shows that you are on board as well, which is a whole different understanding of tolerance. So I think that's sort of the play of the shirt, is to sort of reclaim that term. And again, it's that move to show somebody, oh, well, wait a second, I thought intolerance was bad, but now that you put it that way, I guess maybe I need to think about how the terms are used more carefully. If they're going to be reasonable with you. If they're just emotional, then you may need to.
It's funny because people, you always hear tolerance, but everybody, if they can be honest with themselves, doesn't just tolerate anything or anybody.
Right.
I mean, everybody's selective with, they may act like they're tolerant when they're not tolerant at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's so varying, so varying. See, this is where things are becoming more confusing and trying to redefine themselves.
Right. But now think of the difference, again, this is just the illustration of the class, is think of the difference between you having met somebody a couple times and had some decent conversations, and this comes up in conversation, versus two people shouting at each other that don't know each other, right? Which one is making progress? That's what I think you make more progress in a personal interaction. Okay, so for practice, the idea is one person will ask the other, we'll call it the protagonist and the antagonist. I want the antagonist to start the conversation. In other words, the person that supposedly has a wrong worldview that you're trying to help, I want that person to start the conversation. That way, it eliminates the possibility of saying, well, I don't know how I would start a conversation with somebody. Well, in this scenario, they're starting the conversation. So, the first question will be something like, do you like my new bumper sticker? So this is somebody you know well enough to have a conversation casually. The antagonist is starting the conversation. And then the other person, based on whatever one you pick, the other person will initiate the Columbo tactic. What do you mean by that? And further along in the interaction, how did you come to that conclusion? And then if you get this far, leading questions where you're trying to show what idea actually, show a sound idea versus what might be a mistaken idea. And these other tactics we've been talking about could potentially be useful in interacting with some of these ideas. So there's plenty up there. And if you have if you have a different bumper sticker in mind you've seen, or a T-shirt, feel free to use that as well. But there should be enough material and time to go back and forth, so you can play both roles. And I know I'm the guy that goes into a classroom and goes, "Oh, you're going to make us do an exercise. I don't want to do the exercise. Can I just go?" But one of the big values of thinking about how to interact is actually doing it out loud even before you are in the situation. And that's very helpful to me. I'm left in my natural habitat. I'm a big-time introvert. So for me, it's very helpful. If you're already an extrovert, maybe go ahead.
I would benefit more from this exercise if I would watch, for example, you and Rod, you play one role and let him play the role.
Okay.
And then I could see that difference there, because I don't want to miss out on a good interchange, and I think that's a good one. And to help me understand this more.
Okay.
I don't want to.
We may have to rule out, I mean, we like to talk to each other anyways, and we both have a philosophy background, so we'd have to set down ground rules like no 4-syllable words, nothing with ology on the end. Otherwise, it might not be that beneficial. But well, yeah, we can try that. That's a good idea. Let's try it, and then if there's more time, maybe you guys can break up. But I'll be the antagonist then. I'm trying to pick one. Sometimes I try to do an atheist role play for high school and college age kids, but I always have a hard time doing it because I don't really believe the views. So I can never think of how to argue it because I always am defeating myself in my own mind. Okay, so the bumper sticker I'm picking is no God, no morals, no future. So I have that on my pickup truck. I have the bumper sticker, no God, no morals, no future, on my pickup truck. And I just drove up. Actually, I was at Rod's house, and I just installed a new mailbox for him. And now we're sitting at the back of the truck, and I go, "Rod, what do you think of my new bumper sticker?"
Well, as all bumper stickers, it claims too much.
That's not a question. What do you mean it claims too much? It's just that if it's true, it's true. What do you mean it claims too much?
Well, there are atheistic societies which have very carefully developed moral standards. So therefore, God is not necessary for the formulation of a moral system.
Atheistic.
Non-theistic is what you probably want to say as well. That is, so well over 2/3 of different types of religion, for example, have no notion of God. And yet there's a very careful Buddhist moral system.
Yeah, you're just describing a culture that exists, though, and a religion that exists. What does that have to do with my bumper sticker? I'm saying that's not true.
Your bumper sticker is a lie. That's not true.
Okay, time out. Now, who asked, how many questions did he ask, and how many questions did I ask? I asked more questions. You're supposed to be the protagonist, so.
I guess I don't understand what protagonist is.
Well, you're
I'm
the.
having a discussion with someone else.
You have the protagonist view. I think we had a good discussion, but I defended more heartily, I think, because after I asked you about the bumper sticker, you made a sort of a positive. Well, you were showing an objection, but you were sort of making a positive statement rather than deconstructing my view from the inside. Well, I guess you were, but you were doing it in statement form rather than question form.
Well, I still don't understand it. What I simply mean is God is not a necessary precondition for systems morality. There are many examples through time and space which show that one does not have
Yeah,
to
but
have a particular.
then my response is simply, you're saying something descriptive and my bumper sticker is prescriptive about the nature of reality.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between you describing an exception that's a descriptive one versus,
But that's what governs my opinion with regard to your bumper sticker. That's why I tend not to like bumper stickers. That's why I have no bumper stickers on my car. Apart from the fact that damage the finish. But again, as you look at it and say, okay, are we going to have some kind of evaluative discussion with regard to the content of one or more of these bumper stickers?
yeah.
And yeah, it's a little bit like, and I'm interested in your using the terms descriptive and prescriptive, because that is my illustration with regard to the nature of dictionaries.
Yes.
Some dictionaries are simply descriptive, they just simply tell us how a word is used. Others are prescriptive, and they tell us how a word ought to be used. And for those of us in linguistics, there's a huge move in describing how the language works. That is, how does the statement, no God, no morals, no future, how does that work?
Ah, see, that was much better, in my opinion, because then you're sort of having me parse out the logic of my view rather than saying, no, that's wrong, let me tell you why. Now, in both cases, I think you had valid response. I mean, it was valid, but it just, which one is going to catch more flies, you know? One of the ideas was by asking questions, it's very much easier to keep the burden of proof on the person with the statement, with the slogan out there for everybody to see. But when you say a positive statement, even though it's an objection to a view, I mean, whether you're asking or stating, you're still objecting to my view. But by asking rather than stating, then you're not carrying the burden of proof in the same way. I mean, that's how I feel about it, and that's kind of the idea. But
I would ask the question, being protagonist, why do you have to have God to have morals if there's no God and no morals? Why does God preclude any idea of what's moral? I'd be asking you.
I'm not sure I get it. Rephrase it for me.
If there's no God, there can be no morals. That I get it, because that starts no God, no morals.
Yeah.
Meaning there'll be a moral demise. I interpret, okay, there's a moral demise without God into the mix. So why is it necessary for God to be in the mix of morals for there to be morals at all?
Sure. I want to pursue that, but I want to point something else out too that I just realized. I should have realized. Nobody ever asked, what do you mean by that? Yes. Everyone's assumed already what my worldview is. Nobody's asked me. You just talked through the logic that you're assuming that is there. But what if I haven't even thought that far? What if I just like Richard Dawkins and bought this off of his website? I mean, I may not even need to be held to that much, but odds are if I have that bumper sticker, I probably do know a bit.
Did you just borrow somebody's car?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point because, but your question was,
Why does God need to be in the mix in order for there to be morals at all? Why does that preclude the idea of morality?
Well, I'm an atheist for this exercise. Don't take that out of context, anybody that's watching this. I'm an atheist, and I don't believe in Christ or God, but here's something I share in common with a Christian who knows what they're talking about, is that the moral argument is true. If there's no God, there's no morals. There's no other way to establish morality that makes any sense for a transcendent morality. So when I say no morals, I mean there's no objective morality for everybody. I mean, you can make up your rules in your society if you want, but that doesn't mean anything. Why should I follow that if there's no transcendent morality?
What do you mean by future?
Well, if there's no God, not only is there no overarching transcendent objective morality, there's no meaning, there's no purpose why we're here. I mean, the universe, there's no God, so there's no afterlife, and the universe is dying, and we're all going to die with the universe.
If you died today, where would you go?
Oblivion. I would just cease to exist. Well, if I was reincarnated, and then the world would die in another era, and I would cease to exist.
What if you're wrong?
What if well, then, yeah, I don't know. I guess I could be wrong.
Forever? We're all eternal souls. We're all eternal beings.
Why are we... Now, if I have that bumper sticker and you make that statement, you should know ahead of time that I'm not going to agree with that.
I know.
So the idea is, how can you get me to question that for myself by leading me through my own view rather than saying something that I don't agree with, that you already know I don't agree with? Does that make sense? I mean...
Okay, I'm going to try to be a protagonist here. So then, so there needs to be, and according to your bumper sticker, there needs to be a dispenser of a moral code, because without a dispenser of a moral code, people won't know the difference between right and wrong, or wrong and right, or up or down, or anything else. But what if there's a society without a God that tries to create a moral code that 90% of the members of that society agree on, that they create their own rule to keep order in the community? Why is God needed for that?
God isn't needed for that. That kind of morality is cheap, though. I mean, anybody can make up their rules however they want. What I'm talking about is, if there isn't like an objective reality, like something that says, like some sort of fundamental reality about what's right and wrong that everybody perceives, then who's to say who should do what? I mean, it's all relative to where you're at. So I can just withdraw from that system and say, ultimately, in the big picture, it doesn't really matter what I do. So whatever I can get away with, I'll do. Unless there's a God, in which case there would be an objective grounding of morality that would be for everybody of all times. And
Well, then God tries to prevent, I would say, okay, then God tries to prevent you from suffering, because left it up into deciding on your own what's moral or what's not moral, you might make mistakes, and God is God giving you more this moral codes to keep you from hurting yourself?
So you're saying, like, why? Where do I get this notion of self-preservation? Is that what you mean?
In order to, because if there's no moral code that's dispensed by God and left up to you, let's say the moral is left up to you, who knows where it's, what will take care of it? So in other words, you want God to give you a code to keep you from destroying yourself. Because you're even at its best, the human idea has flaws, and only God can decide the ultimate right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and I'm denying all that. I don't think there is any ultimate right and wrong, because I don't see any reason for God to exist. I wouldn't.
Where's that bumper sticker? What if you put no morals on the left side and no God
Well, I don't think it has to be in order. I think it's just a collection of three things. I mean, I guess in philosophically speaking, you could say that no God precedes no morals and it precedes no future, but it's not like a therefore on the bumper sticker. There's no arrow pointing between them. Anyways.
I find myself very confused by that message, and
Yeah.
I could think about it all night and then get further confused.
Right. So I think what was most beneficial was when people started asking me to expound, basically. Well, what does that bumper sticker even mean? Like, so then I start to make a statement. Now, I think a very important point is, especially if this is somebody who has spent a great deal of time thinking about this. I mean, you probably have, if you have this bumper sticker on your car, you're probably not somebody who just saw it at a store and said, oh, that's cool. You're probably somebody who already read a bunch of stuff and then made a decision and then was so deep in that decision that they got a bumper sticker. So with this person, unless I specifically wanted to interact with some of these deeper views, I would ask them, what do you mean by that? Could you explain how those three things go together, or things like that, and let them talk for a period of time, and I would come back to that conversation later. I would not go as far as we went. I would, even me personally, as somebody who studied philosophy, I probably wouldn't go too far. I'd want to be very careful about terms and things like that, and come back to it.
I was wondering if you would it be appropriate to then ask you, do you personally affirm this, or do you personally deny this? That is, I know of people who put the statements on their bumpers,
Oh,
which they are not affirming. That is, if you have this bumper sticker, no God, no morals, no future,
right.
you're actually arguing against it.
Yeah, like let's say out of this discussion tonight, I realized that and I said, you know what, this would be a great conversation starter. I'm going to put this on my truck and see what happens. And then I come upon another conversation with, alternate rod. and you start to go right into, well, let me tell you why that's wrong. And I say, hey, chill out, man. I have it there so that I can drum up conversations with people who don't believe in God. But actually, yeah, it's the way I was headed, even though I was sort of defending the atheist position a little bit and citing with the logic of the moral argument, I was actually almost performing a reductio ad absurdum on myself by having to spell out the view. At some point, with that person, probably down the line, I would want to see if they'd be willing to entertain talking about an argument for God's existence, like the Kalam or something like that, and see what their thoughts were. That would tell me whether they've engaged at a deep level or if they're sort of at a slogan level.